All right, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed panelists, distinguished guests, thank you all for joining us to discuss threats to human security in the Global South. Before we get started, I do want to thank the Soufan Center as well as the State of Qatar for organizing and for their hospitality. So you might be wondering what encompasses the Global South. I think it's important for us to define that before we begin our panel. It really depends on what source you ask, but most of the countries that fall into the Global South, largely sources look at the UN Human Development Index as well as the Brandt line, which is a wandering borderline. It largely ignores geography completely and instead focuses on GDP per capita. So the countries that fall into the Global South are often those that are the least developed, that have lower scores on the Human Development Index. And why that's important is because it's roughly 130 countries. So it is a vast territory and also a very diverse set of countries. Emerging economies, as I mentioned, histories of colonialism, each with very unique socio-political landscapes and historical narratives. But this region also bears the brunt of some of the most pressing challenges of our time, from conflict to terrorism, human rights abuses, gender-based violence, food insecurity, climate disasters, the digital divide. These are just a few of the threats that loom large on the horizon. And while these issues are global in nature, they are often manifested most starkly in the Global South because these are parts of the world that often have the least resources and are the least prepared to deal with these challenges. So today, I'm very privileged to have all of you join us on this panel, distinguished panel of experts who will guide us through these complex issues. They have very diverse backgrounds, extensive lived experiences to provide us with a unique lens to examine these threats. And as we navigate this discussion, I'm personally most curious to hear from you all how we move from abstract concepts to actionable and concrete steps that will improve the lives of those most impacted by these global but also very local issues. So, Your Excellency Hekmat Karzai, if we could please start with you. In your extensive experience with international diplomacy, with peace processes, what parallels do you see between the challenges faced by Afghanistan, which loomed large in the news across the world for largely 2 decades, and those experienced in the Global South, particularly in terms of human security?
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Thank you so much. Let me start by thanking the Soufan group. Also, gratitude to Qatar here for inviting us. It is a pleasure to be back in Doha. I have a lot of memories from this hall. It's good to be here. Regarding your question, I think there are many parallels that Afghanistan has with the Global South. Let me highlight a few of them and then also provide you an example that illustrates how Afghanistan is also unique. If you look at food insecurity, there's a humanitarian situation where about 30% of the population requires international assistance. There are security challenges with groups such as ISIS-K and others posing challenges. Very recently, in a very peaceful province in Bamyan, 7 individuals were killed, 3 being Spanish tourists, in a place that was quite peaceful. In addition, there are political issues where it's difficult to express yourself with various other authoritarian regimes if you look in the Global South. But also there are a lot of environmental challenges. Those are challenges that I think it's difficult to deal with. Afghanistan in the last few years had a drought, but in the last few weeks we have had severe rain, and this rain has caused massive floods, and these floods have killed hundreds of people. Many countries, to deal with these issues of climate change, are part of COP28, COP27, the UN framework, but to COP28, Afghanistan was not invited because of the Taliban. So the population suffers because of the regime that is there. But it's also because the Taliban has enacted policies that further isolates them, whether it's human rights or whether it's creating a government that is composed of mostly clerics. So it's created problems for the country as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you. And you've mentioned these various authoritative regimes. You've talked about the Taliban as an insurgency, now as a government. You've mentioned ISIS. Wassim, I'd like to pivot over to you. You're the only Western journalist that I know that has spent time in Idlib, correct, in Syria, and one of your last panelists brought up that region. You've met the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria, which is an offshoot of al-Qaeda. You've spent time in this Christian village under that type of authoritarian rule. I'd like for you to draw on your expertise as a journalist and elaborate on the dynamics of these various jihadist groups that are in the Middle East and their impact on global security. And I'm most interested in your thoughts about how recent geopolitical shifts in the Middle East have impacted and influenced the strategies of these groups.
Sure, thank you. Well, thank you for your question. I thank, of course, the organizers of this event for being here, so you see me again. And yes, Idlib was quite a particular trip, and actually I was there because I saw something new happening there. You had a former al-Qaeda offshoot saying that global jihad was a mistake while they are still at power in Idlib, not in jailed or diminished, and saying we are going to go through another path, a third path, which actually is less rigorous than the Taliban. So I had to go see by myself, because it was a first. We have a jihadi offshoot, like saying, okay, we want to get local. And we denounce terrorism, we denounce a global jihad, just let us rule in an Islamic way as we wish. So I had to see it for myself. And it was quite interesting because when you see, for example, the malls that they built, you have mixing women and men in the malls. It was a reality. You see women going to schools. You see people smoking in the street. You hear music in the shops. And that for a jihadi group, it's like wow, for those who are familiar with those kinds of groups. So again, I had to see it by myself, and that's what I saw. But I also saw, I'm not saying that it is not rigorous. It is rigorous, but it is less rigorous than the Taliban. So it's a new thing that could be maybe implemented in other areas of the world that we'll get to talk about later. So, and the most particular thing about this, to get us also into our subject, that in the area of Idlib, you have millions of displaced and refugees. I visited a camp on the Turkish border where you have 1.5 million persons living in it, in tents. You see? What's going to happen with all those people? If any geopolitical shift happens, if the Turkish army decides to retreat from Idlib, because actually the buffer zone between HTS and the Syrian regime is held by Turkish outposts. And this is not, it is known, but it's not very, it's not put under the lights. You see, they have they invested more than 5,000 military there in order to secure this area. And on the other hand, when you look at what's happening there, you understand that those 1.5 million in this camp and others, we are like almost around the 3 million between the displaced and the refugees. Who wants to handle them? The Turks don't. Assad regime can't and won't and don't have the will. And among them, you have so many foreigners, meaning kids, foreign fighters that we talked about in former panels, either in the ranks of HTS or demobilized, as we say. Like today, they are bus drivers, they are cooks from European nations. French, we have more than 200 French nationals there, between kids, women, and men. So who's going to handle this humanitarian problem before talking about it as a security problem? Who's going to handle it? And the thing is that we were talking also with a few minutes ago with the UN. When I was there, I saw the first cruise of the United Nations enter officially, at least. I saw them entering. 2 cars. Not that much, but still. You see? And they went to, because there they have what they call a salvation government, with a minister, which became the prime minister now. But at the time I met him, he was minister of humanitarian relief and development, They have a Ministry of Humanitarian Relief. And so they're trying to tackle this issue this way. You know, they tried, for example, to issue IDs in order at least to know who's in those camps. How many nationalities, how many men, how many women, how many underage. Even this information wasn't available at the time. So there's a huge work to be done, and the geopolitical turmoil in this region, the Turks leaving, the Syrian army entering, the Americans leaving, could cause many problems on those levels. We talked a few minutes ago about the Qatari relief team that entered Syria. It was the only international team that entered this area. Can you imagine? While tens of teams were just on the other side of the border. You know, I saw people taking rubble with their hands in order to save or to extract corpses without any equipment. We talked about machinery. The difficulty of entering, allowing huge, heavy machinery to go in. So this I witnessed, and this is a real huge problem. And this is why, when you have groups like this denouncing or denying or getting away from global terrorism, maybe there is something to be done, and maybe an example can be used in order to demobilize others. It was a first for the third pass, and I wanted to see it by myself. It doesn't mean the situation is stabilized. Now the situation is very critical, even for HTS itself. Syrians are again in the streets in Idlib in order to denounce the human rights abuses by HTS now. You see? So you are in areas where you have to tackle it, as the Taliban were accepted at one point because of the threat of the Islamic State. You see? So that's the way it goes now.
Thank you. And it is fascinating to see how these various groups can morph and change over time. Moving from this broader security landscape, thank you so much, Wassim, for sharing that throughout the Middle East. I'd like to come to Adejoke, an expert on the African continent, and get your thoughts on this intersection of sexual, gender-based violence and terrorism. So Wassim's talked about women and children. I'm very interested in your thoughts on how these issues of gender-based violence and terrorism are at an interplay, especially in the global south, but specifically, if you could, talking about Africa, the Sahel.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Also, join the others to thank the organizers. Thank you to the Soufan Center and the government of Qatar for organizing this important forum and inviting me to it. I wanted to start off by saying that SGBV, the link between SGBV and terrorism is an excellent example of the intersection of human security, threats to human security, and threats to issues that are considered national or state security matters. And this is an area where we really have to get rid of the outdated assumptions that sort of pit human security issues, like sort of human security is more like a development issue, and then threats to national security, we require militarized responses and so on. We can see this abundant evidence that terrorist groups have used over the years, have used SGBV in different ways, including ways that are integral to their operations. So for example, Al-Shabaab uses abduction, rape, forced marriage as a means to subjugate those that are within the territories that they control. You also have gendered narratives that Boko Haram adopted, for instance, to recruit as well as indoctrinate and radicalize female students for them to become suicide bombers, for example. So there are ways that gender, whether it's gender narratives or sexual and gender-based violence, have been adopted by these terrorist groups. Another way, very obvious way, is where SGBV is used as a weapon to terrorize a civilian population. So the same way that they would use guns and murders and so on, SGBV is being used as a way to terrorize the population or to cause instability. Because you also have evidence showing that the fear of SGBV has also driven forced displacement. So that's another threat to human security that we're talking about. And then, of course, I think there's another important area that is often overlooked is how SGBV contributes to the financing of terrorist groups. And so you have direct financial gains. For instance, the Financial Action Task Force issued a report in 2019 noting that in 2014 alone, ISIS had received between 35 to 45 million US dollars from the Yazidi community. And this included ransom payments, where the community were paying to get their abducted and trafficked women and girls back. And we're not even considering the indirect financial gains, where through SGBV, these groups are able to sustain themselves, right, or use it as a means of recruiting fighters. So it goes back to the earlier point that I made about the need to break down sort of these assumptions that put, some of these threats to human security, such as poverty, economic inequalities, structural inequalities, and say, well, these are development issues that we don't really have a lot of money for, but then we have a lot of money for the militarized responses to terrorism, whereas we're not understanding how those are drivers of the conflict. Given another example, Boko Haram has used the economic frustrations that men and boys have in the region to say, well, come join us because then we will take care of your family, right? So those are just some examples where I think, it's important to emphasize that interconnectedness. SGBV's link to terrorism is an excellent way where we can see very clearly that there's actually no separation between the threat to human security and the threat to national security.
And Ajoke, as a follow-up, do you feel like there are enough people that are impacted by this in the decision-making processes in the various areas where you have done your research? Or do you feel like those most impacted are largely left out of the conversations when it comes to decision-making?
That's a great question. So a lot more is being done to bring them into the conversations, but for the longest time, I would say they're left out. And that's also partly because of the way that counterterrorism, the global counterterrorism agenda has developed essentially in a way that really focuses on, threats like imminent threats, military responses. And so now we're beginning to see those connections, and we're beginning to see, the bringing in of community groups and so on in the discussion, but definitely more needs to be done.
Thank you so much. Transitioning from these on-the-ground I will get that right next time, I promise. Transitioning from these in-person realities on the ground to online spaces, Noreen, I'd like to hear from you about the strategies that adversarial actors are employing to exploit these local conflicts and grievances, and how they're amplified through online platforms, and what you see as the implications for human security because of that exploitation.
Thanks for the question, Lyla, and a huge thank you to the Soufan Center team. It's really an honor to be back here at GSF and with this tremendous panel. And I think your question really highlights the one takeaway I'd like the audience to think about, which is that intersection between offline and online. And, adversarial actors are really good at exploiting the divisive dynamics that are already happening offline. And it's important to remember that, a lot of times we hear about online radicalization. There are a lot of offline dynamics leading to that, and certainly offline implications. So I think that's a really key intersection. Throughout the global south as well as the global north, we see this playing out in terms of helping fuel and kind of inflame already divisive rhetoric. In South Asia, for example, we've seen this, so-called love jihad, this hateful rhetoric about minority communities that is often amplified, sometimes by political leaders, sometimes by very strategic, communications campaigns online and offline. And this has real-world implications because it's fostering already in place kind of xenophobic out-group dynamics. But of course, when you go online, you can amplify this, to the X degree. And so I think that that's certainly one example where we see the existing intra-communal kind of community tensions leading to a very divisive online campaign and then coming back into the communities and having offline dynamics. And I think that unfortunate rhetoric of love jihad has been picked up also by political parties. And so it's no longer just sort of terrorist, violent extremists kind of amplifying this rhetoric. It is being picked up by political actors and having very real world political implications. These are the folks in charge of your development, your municipal allocations, everything. So when this becomes mainstream politics, it's worrisome. You know, we heard yesterday, and certainly from folks like Jibril Basole, who mentioned, there are in the Sahel grievances about real conflicts, the behaviors of the state, the behaviors of international actors, and adversarial groups have picked up on this and amplified it through disinformation campaigns, propaganda online. And we've heard about how a lot of this online campaign has fueled this popular sentiment now against international actors. So it has implications for, you know, international peacekeeping efforts, international counterterrorism efforts, and certainly some of the atrocities we're hearing about in the Sahel. I'm not saying the presence of international actors would definitively stop it. It didn't. That's part of the problem. But certainly there'll be less accountability and fewer eyes on it particularly. And we've seen the online campaign play a big part on that. You know, I was speaking to a couple of officials, Latin American officials earlier this year, actually. And they were talking about the emergence of far-right extremism in a number of Latin American contexts, the increasing incidence of school shootings, and the increasing insecurity that has brought to communities. And the concern is that, you know, political boundaries don't apply in online spaces. So audiences, young people, they're seeing things happening in different parts of the world. They're getting ideas. And so this idea of school shootings, unfortunately, you know, being picked up by kids who might find that to be an exciting way to make a name for themselves or whatever the rationale is. And suddenly in Latin America, they're seeing an incidence of insecurity that they feel, you know, online angles and dimensions have really helped amplify that. So I think that intersection between offline and online experiences is something that we really have to remember doesn't happen in a vacuum. And it does, you know, you have human security challenges amplifying online risks, but then you have online content coming back offline and, you know, amplifying human security risks.
Thank you so much for that, Noreen, and thank you for that example, as devastating as it is, from Latin America as well. We often tend to focus on very specific geographic areas of the world, so I really appreciate you expanding that aperture. Hekmat, I'd like to come back to you. General Miller was here yesterday, and I know you two have a relationship from your time in Afghanistan. He made the comment that if you don't have a political track to end a conflict, then you're just killing people, or you're just getting people killed. And I'd like your thoughts on what can the international community do better when it comes to supporting conflict resolution and peace building, drawing from these lessons that we've all learned in Afghanistan. And I'm particularly interested in your thoughts about how we ensure some kind of sustainable peace in regions where there have been protracted conflicts for decades.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a very good question. Let me share with you two lessons that I think we should have learned. If not, there will be significant consequences as we're witnessing in Afghanistan. The first one I think is important. It's about making sure you know where you are. You know the people that you're engaged with. You know their culture. You know their dynamics. I will add further one thing, which is that you also know the region, because there's so many dynamics that the region, especially when there are rivalries, when there are countries that have competition with one another. So a lot of people came into this not knowing where they were operating, and particularly what was the region that they were dealing with. So you had countries such as India and Pakistan with their strategic rivalry. You had Iran and Saudi. You had the Sunni-Shia rivalry. All of these were being played out in Afghanistan, and there were many who were oblivious to this. That was one particular issue. The second thing where we faced enormous amount of challenge was that for the first 10 years in Afghanistan, there was no political plan. The United States came into Afghanistan with vengeance, and I want to be frank here. And they captured not only Al-Qaeda and Taliban, they also arrested hundreds and thousands of ordinary Afghans. They put them in Guantanamo, they put them in Bagram, and as a consequence, the population, the mentality shifted. They went into Afghanistan with this hammer mentality where everything looks like a nail, and you keep biting with that. At the outset, after 9/11, I myself, we witnessed there were many senior Taliban commanders who surrendered. There were peace overtures, but we never took them because we were not interested in peace. As time went by, the insurgency grew, and only after 10 years, we developed a political plan. But by that time, the insurgency had spread throughout various parts of the country. So as a lesson, particularly for any conflict, make sure when you're going in there, you have a way out. You have a political plan as to how you're going to end this conflict. And sadly, we ended up not finishing the conflict, but we just left it.
Thank you very much, Hekmat. Speaking of protracted conflicts, Wassim, if we could come back to you. You've also covered Africa and the Sahel for about a decade, if not longer, in your role at France 24. I'd like to hear from you about the topic of human rights abuses. I know you've done some investigations related to that by regular and loyalist forces. Could you talk to us a little bit about how those human rights abuses have actually benefited jihadist groups in the region?
Sure, thank you for this question. Well, I'm going to tell you a story, so bear with me. That was the latest work I've done a few days ago for France 24 in all 3 languages. And it was about 2 massacres in Burkina Faso. So 2 massacres conducted by the military and by local militias. And so it occurred on the 25th of February in northern Burkina Faso in a town called Soro. Okay? So there was an investigation by Human Rights Watch, very good investigation with local witnesses that witnessed, who were shot, who were, by the way, Minister Jibril Basole mentioned this work, and I thank him for this. He mentioned it yesterday, my work. And so Human Rights Watch worked on this aspect with satellite imagery and testimonies from the locals. The New York Times worked with videos of the burial sites, but with corpses already buried. So it's a story of blood and despair. I'm sorry. The missing link between the killing and the burial was the footage of the bodies. And when we talk bodies, we talk women, men, children, and babies. Some witnesses said that the only ones who had the footage of the bodies, the first ones who were on the spot a few hours after the massacre conducted by the army, were jihadis of Jama'at Nusrat al-Muslimin, means Al-Qaeda. So I managed to get this footage. So can you imagine that to make a case regarding this massacre, the missing link is provided by Al-Qaeda jihadis, you see? And at the same time, I got footage of another massacre conducted also by the army in eastern Burkina Faso, in an area southern of the town of Dori. So this footage might have never came out if I haven't asked the question, you see? And if local witnesses haven't told Human Rights Watch that Al-Qaeda came and they filmed, they have footage, they're the only ones who have footage. So can you imagine what's happening in the Sahel region? And to go a little bit more into details, for example, today, Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State are waging a bloody war against each other in the Sahel region, across Niger, Burkina Faso, and especially Mali. So it is very particular to understand and to comprehend that actually those who are preventing the Islamic State from going further south in the countries of the Gulf of Guinea, well, it's Al-Qaeda. It's not local armies. So can you imagine what kind of evolution we have on the ground in this regard? And I had also the opportunity to write a very documented piece for CTC West Point in 2022 in December 2022 about the impact of Wagner mercenaries in Mali, their impact on jihadi factions. And the impact is positive for the jihadis because they are recruiting more and more, and because of the retreat of the French army and now the American army from Niger, Agadez, they have a de facto no-fly zone. So they can gather, they can fight each other, and they can control territory. So you have an immediate security and military threat by the Islamic State. But on the other hand, when you leave the populations like this, well, they go the way of Al-Qaeda, meaning Al-Qaeda is getting more and more entrenched politically and socially in these areas. And the thing is, and I'll end up by saying this, that you can imagine looking at this from afar, they are fighting each other, so be it. They are killing each other. But the other aspect of it, the side effect of this, is that populations that are fighting, they are locals, right? So locals are being radicalized, but because it's much easier to tell a jihadi fighter to go fight a foreign army, easy, a little bit harder to tell him to fight a local army, but very hard. You have to be really dogmatized to fight a fellow jihadi. And they are sending kamikaze, suicide bombers against each other. So to demobilize those fighters, it's going to be so difficult, you know? And this is why also, I think engaging actors who want to engage on the ground should be a tool used by international diplomacy and by state actors who are willing to do so. Because we were in the tunnel of CT, like meaning counterterrorism, for 20 years, where only it is hitting with a hammer, everybody's a nail, while each territory has a specificity that could be used. If you look a little bit down history, you can see that many groups like the PLO, like the IRA, or other groups, when you enter negotiations, you have the hardest part of the group that splits, and others who negotiate. And you cannot, being a jihadi, being a radical, isn't a sickness, you see? It's a political ideology. You can disengage them from political violence. You cannot change what's in their heads, you see? So this is why I think that we are in a very critical point in history with global powers going back into rough confrontation and dirty confrontation on the Russian side, on the African continent in particular, where things have to be thought over. What's the end point? Do we want free democratic countries all over the world? Do we want issues like women's rights, gender equality, etc., to be the fight? Or the fight is to not to have bomb attacks in Paris and Washington, you know? So the answer, of course, is in the middle, you see? And we have to think out of the box in order to find new solutions. And negotiations with those who want to negotiate should be a tool as the military tool, the security tool, and all the other tools that are available for international power brokers and actors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wassim. You and Hekmat are in fact echoing each other in that it all comes back to negotiations, to a political track, that the military piece is not enough. It can't be the only way in which these conflicts come to an end. That's just not what history shows us. And so thank you for building on Hekmat's point. Sadly, continuing on the topic of human rights abuses, though, Adejoke, I know that part of your research has investigated these underlying challenges, especially when it comes to accountability for sexual and gender-based violence in the context of terrorism. I'd like for you to go a little bit deeper on what those challenges are and how can the international community address them. 49.7% of the world is women and girls. And like you mentioned, they're largely left out. So what can we do as an international community to ensure that their rights are protected?
Perfect, thank you. So in discussing with various members of the communities of practice dealing in this counterterrorism space and dealing with accountability in general, and then specifically for sexual and gender-based violence, one of the key challenges that comes up, really, I think you had mentioned it in your introduction, is the issue of resources. So lack of funding, lack of resources that would help have effective investigations and then, of course, prosecutions of these crimes. And so what we've seen, and this is not even just the Global South issue, actually, this is pervaded, I would say, the CT accountability space, where it's so much easier to charge membership of a terrorist organization, right? Because you don't need that much evidence. You don't really need a lot of investigative capacity for that. You don't have to go to active conflict zones to try to get evidence from, or testimony from witnesses. You've captured somebody, most likely in the context that is evidence enough that the person was a member, and so you can use your CT laws and charge that. Of course, there's increasing acknowledgement that when you do that and you follow that approach, you're missing the substantive crimes that this individual may be involved in, or missing the opportunity to collect relevant linkage evidence that would help you get the higher ups. So more effort is being put in that direction of addressing substantive crimes, but it goes back to lack of funding. And so when you're dealing with traditional donor-dependent funding, it really depends on what the priorities are, or even within the governments, depends what the priorities are to see which unit is funded, to be able to do the kinds of investigations that you need to have successful SGBV and terrorism-related investigations. So that's one challenge. Another challenge I'll highlight is and it's connected in a way, it's a siloed approach to accountability. So for example, you may have counterterrorism units that are embedded within the national security agencies, and their focus, understandably, is on addressing imminent threats, collecting intelligence, and they're not necessarily equipped, nor are they instructed to focus on collecting evidence of sexual and gender-based violence, right? And so you have a gap in terms of the evidence collection. Those who are on the scene and those who have the capacity to collect it may not be focusing on, on that. So that's one gap. And this ties into the third, and there are many challenges, but I'll just highlight three. So this ties into the third one that I want to highlight, which again is pervasive across the CT space, including in the international CT space, where you have gendered notions of terrorism and counterterrorism. So, for those who have such notions, SGBV in their mind is not an act of terrorism, right? So even though I've given the examples that I gave earlier, and you do have Security Council resolutions and evidence that demonstrates how SGBV committed in the context of terrorism can contribute to threats to international peace and security, you still have members of the CT space who don't necessarily see that. And so for them, it's not a priority on their agenda, and that's, that then affects back to resources, that then affects, what time is allocated, that then affects how accountability happens. So those are three overarching challenges. How can the international community address these? And I'll just focus on one, which I would say is the biggest challenge, of course, being the resources. And so one way to address the resource deficit, I would say, is innovative thinking around the generation of funds. Given the challenges accessing traditional funding sources, maybe we can consider other ways, such as leveraging private investment schemes. So an example is the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. It's a sustainable investment vehicle that is aimed at funding initiatives that improve the lives of children in the Global South. You also have the UN Trust Fund for Human Security, and that is funded by voluntary contributions, sadly, just a few member states, but it's funded by voluntary contributions and the interest earned on those voluntary contributions. So here you are leveraging the expertise and knowledge around private investment and hedge fund management and things like that for an important issue, such as the Children Investment Fund focused on children in the Global South. Why can't we do this to address accountability for SGBV-connected terrorism? One of the key points that is widely accepted, it's in Security Council resolutions, is that all forms and manifestations of terrorism should be prioritized, and SGBV is a form of manifestation of terrorism when you see these ways that the terrorist groups are using it. And so we have to prioritize it, both in terms of the funding, in terms of the mechanisms that are focused on this, and of course in terms of accountability.
Adejoke, thank you so much. Those are very innovative and out-of-the-box ways of thinking, and I hope that you talk to some folks in the audience who maybe are involved in investment banking and start having those conversations with them. So thank you for bringing that up. Staying on women and children, Noreen, if we could come to you, how do you see the amplification of this offline violence in online spaces disproportionately affecting women and children and minority groups in the Global South?
Thanks, Lyla. So as we were saying earlier, online campaigns really mirror offline worlds, right? And they push at doors that are already open. So communities and individuals that are already marginalized and at risk in the offline space will have that risk mirrored in the online space. And I think that is not actually particular to the global south. Political boundaries sometimes dissolve in online spaces. We've seen this dynamic in the global north as well. And certainly we are seeing a disproportionate emphasis on youth. And we are seeing with more and more young people online, some of the concerns about the impacts on them and the impacts by them are amplified because online you can do a lot. Shifting very quickly to the global north, there were terrorism convictions in the UK, frankly, of teenagers who were managing, far-right groups through an online platform. And so, I think around the world, these concerns about who is marginalized, who has power, are reflected online. I think the challenge with a lot of this and how it affects marginalized communities lies in what's sometimes called borderline content online, material that's what we call lawful but awful. A lot of it is in terms of memes, in terms of images, in terms of kind of sarcastic, nasty inferences. But that's really difficult for content moderators online to understand. And so a lot of these memes, this kind of hateful content, can be referencing cultural context, can be referencing, racist, exclusionary rhetoric, but it's not always clear that it is unlawful content online, or it's not always clear in what cultural context how this might be targeting women, children, youth disproportionately, right? Because a lot of this content might look different depending where you're sitting, how words are used. And I think that's a challenge we really need to think about. At GiveCT, we invest a lot in research and analysis to work with our 30 member tech companies to actually get access to research and analysis about different contexts with a different global lens. I think I've heard from a number of people here that GNet resources have been useful to them. I hope that is also something more and more of our companies are using. And so that's how I think is one very dangerous way that this disproportionate impact on marginalized communities can be perpetuated online. I don't want to just leave it at that, though. I do want to point out that through online tools and a lot of companies, there's a lot of opportunity to counter this rhetoric and offer opportunities to mitigate some of these risks, whether it is education, whether it is redirection, whether it's about reaching communities that may not always be reached by, offline actors, but they can be reached online, whether it's through whatever kind of local support, education resources. Again, so we often talk about tech and online spaces as places of risk. I also want to make sure we think about this as places of opportunity, perhaps where marginalized communities and individuals can actually access more resources to support them and maybe act in a way that they couldn't necessarily in an offline space where they would be more vulnerable or insecure. So I think that sort of duality of that online space is important to remember.
I'd like to come back to you, Noreen, at the end and have you share some of the strategies that could be most helpful. So thank you for that. It's fascinating to hear about the role of youth and teenagers managing some of these online spaces. Hekmat, if we could come back to you, continuing to talk about the role of youth in this conflict resolution, conflict prevention, peace space. In your role with the Center for Conflict and Peace Studies, what have you seen to be the most effective strategies for engaging youth when it comes to peace building initiatives and conflict resolution?
Sure. Before I answer your question, I want to highlight one particular thing, which is that Afghanistan is the only country in the world where girls after grade 6 cannot go to school. Let that sink in. They cannot go to university, they cannot work, they cannot even have a business. There's absolutely no justification for that, either in Islam or in our culture. It's absolutely abhorrent on so many different levels. I mean, when the first revelation came to the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, it was Iqra, which was to read. So Islam makes it mandatory to have both education for boys and girls. Yet in Afghanistan today, girls are not able to go to school. Also culturally, in Afghanistan, women were able to vote before women in Europe were able to vote. So there's no cultural precedent for this as well. So what I seek here is, especially with international partners and Muslim countries, in their engagement, particularly with the Taliban, to talk about why it's important to have your youth educated. By youth, I don't mean just boys. By youth, I mean both boys and girls getting educated. The difficulty with our region is that there are so many grievances. There are so many issues that will pull youth from you. There's poverty, there's radicalizations, and if you do not educate your youth, they become cannon fodder for somebody else. So what you see now, major terrorist groups recruiting these individuals, and because they have no hope, because they don't have an opportunity, they end up joining those groups. So again, going back to education, that is the only way to bring them in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hekmat. I remember the end of a book that was also turned into a movie called Charlie Wilson's War. And at the end of that book and movie, Charlie Wilson is asking for just $1 million to build schools in Afghanistan. And this is at the end of the Soviet conflict in the 1980s. And Congress essentially said, who cares about Afghanistan? Because he felt very similarly to you that the only way truly to change a region was through education. And so as an Afghan myself, it is devastating to see what is happening in Afghanistan. And I also appreciate your comments about the Muslim world joining to help support that educational fight.
But that same Congress provided billions of dollars to radicalize Afghans and to fight against the Russians.
They did. That's right. That's right. Wassim, we've talked about a variety of different topics so far. And again, as a journalist who has covered some of the most difficult parts of the world when it's come to conflict and terrorism, Middle East and Africa over the last decade or so, what do you see as some of the emerging threats that the countries in the global south, as well as obviously the international community, need to be prepared to address in the future, given that we are all interconnected?
Well, in my humble opinion, the biggest threat today is idiocracy and the lack of education. That's the biggest threat today. And it is not only about the global south. It also concerns developed countries. When you see extremism going up in all Western democracies, fake news, conspiracy theories, in my humble opinion, it is the biggest threat, because those kind of threats transform into security and systematic threats. We were talking about children, we were talking about youngsters. I told you about camps in Idlib. I told you about massacres in Burkina Faso and in Mali and in Niger. We are talking about very young countries where a huge part of the youth is out of the educational system. There's no education. So if they don't radicalize and join jihadi groups or extremist groups, whatsoever, whatever the banner is, they might join criminal groups. You see, this is also a new kind of threat that can get transnational. You see, it should be taken into consideration. And the key for all this is education, is awareness but also understanding local dynamics and what fits a country and doesn't fit another, Of course, Western democracies should uphold their principles, but should they impose them in some countries where the society itself is conservative, you see? Because other powers are playing on this tune, if I may say so, you see? When you see, for example, in Sweden or Norway, a Quran being burned in the street, And when you see Vladimir Putin picking on it, going to Dagestan, taking Quran himself in his hands and saying this would never happen in Russia, this echoes what you can call, what you can label as the global south, you know. Also in terms of social behavior, you see, social behavior of the rights of sexual minorities, for example. Should it be advocated all over the globe or not? On how? If it should be, how should it be? You see, because we are getting into a gray area. For example, in some areas for the locals in some African countries, democracy as a principle became the equivalent in their minds as a perception of corruption of the political elites and of the Western deprivation, you see? And this is how it is being played. This is why I said we should have some thinking out of the box. We have values to uphold, sure, but how and when? Because democracy without education, it doesn't fit. And you see today the most in the countries where you had coup d'etats in Burkina, Mali, and Niger one more time, the urban youth in the capitals is pro-juntas, is pro-military. They didn't know the dictatorships that their grandparents and their parents lived through. And they think that democracy is a failure at best, or at worst, it's a deprivation. And so they see in those military leaders a solution, which is a fake solution, you see? And I think that this is one of the biggest threats that should be tackled very seriously. Create awareness and uphold values in a new way. In a new way. You cannot have imposed conditions on those countries. For example, you have a package of aid, and you have a chapter about something which is totally from outer space for them, a subject, for example. You cannot have military training for an army without going into names and impose on your officer, your Western officer, to teach gender equality. You can teach it maybe another way, but not under the military training banner, you see? So all this, I think, should be tackled on spot, but also regarding Western public opinions. The world is changing, you see, and public opinions should be aware about the difficulties that international diplomacy is facing in those hotspots of the globe. Hope I answered.
No, thank you so much, Wassim. I would agree with you that there is a need to be more culturally intelligent and think about the context in which the international community is entering. It goes back to many of your comments as well, Your Excellency, of understanding the histories and the region and the makeup of the people that you're working with and the mentality and what they have endured and seen. Because quite frankly, the developing nations have a choice these days in who they want to work with or work alongside. And if we're not careful, then we're actually going to end up alienating the very partners that we want to help and support. So thank you for that. As we enter into our last few minutes, Adejoke, if I could come back to you. You and I had a brief conversation earlier. You mentioned that there's a case study that you would like to address, and I'd very much like for you to share with the audience an example of a successful prosecution as we end in these last few minutes of conflict-related sexual violence and crime. I would like to know what led up to that and what can we learn from that?
Okay, awesome. So trying to end on a positive or a slightly more positive note. So, you know, I think I mentioned earlier that there is more being done to address the substantive crimes, including SGBV, and various countries are using whatever legal frameworks are available to them. So whether addressing these crimes as core international crimes or using the national penal codes. The case I want to mention actually comes out of Nigeria because they used a very innovative approach where they addressed the SGBV that was committed in the context of terrorism as an act of terrorism. So they used their counterterrorism laws to prosecute a former Boko Haram member who amongst several other terrorism-related crimes had committed the crimes of rape, forced marriage, forced pregnancy, and slavery of 2 girls aged 16 and 18. And this is really interesting because the fact that Nigeria used the CT laws in this way, because Nigeria's counterterrorism law, like most countries' CT legislation, it does not mention anything about sexual violence, right? So there's no, amongst the enumerated list of acts of terrorism, SGBV is not mentioned. In fact, very few countries, I think there are probably 2 or thereabouts, Gambia and Tunisia, that are notable because they have included sexual violence or an element of sexual violence in their counterterrorism law. So how then do the prosecutors, deal with this challenge where they could see very clearly that the SGBV committed was integral to the actions and the activities of Boko Haram? And so this is where myself and others came in terms of like technical assistance, enhancing the knowledge of basically the strategic litigation using the CT law, where you look at what are the elements of the crimes of terrorism, and what are, so for instance, one of the elements is an attack that may cause serious bodily harm or death. And so looking at the physical element of forced pregnancy, for example, that it is an attack that may cause serious bodily harm or death. And, I cannot give enough praises to the bravery of these prosecutors to say, what, we're going to try this, and they actually tried it, and it was successful. And what I also want to highlight too is not only were the prosecutors innovative in bringing this case, you also had some innovation on the part of the judge. This was the very first time seeing a case of sexual violence using the CT laws, but she was able to grasp and understand the gravity of the crimes, and so the sentences were commensurate to the gravity. So it wasn't treated as a separate opportunistic crime that sometimes some people may see sexual violence as an opportunistic aspect or a side effect of conflict, a side effect of terrorism. No, she was able to say that it was integral, it was core. And so the sentence, each count of sexual violence was awarded about, I think, 40 years, which was more than all the other terrorism-related offenses that he was. So it's an amazing case, and I think in a way it reminds me of Nelson Mandela's quote that it always seems impossible until it's done. And here we have a classic example where it's done. And so hopefully this can engender in us or inspire us, the international community, other states, to say how can we do this ourselves in our own jurisdiction.
Thank you so much, Adejoke. What an amazing story and a precedent now that has been set that others can look to. Thank you for that. Lastly, Noreen, you mentioned in your previous remarks about education, redirection, resources, that oftentimes the online space is seen as a place of risk, but it's also a place of opportunity. I'd like to hear from you in our final few minutes about some of those effective strategies that, whether it's government, civil societies, international actors, that we can employ.
Thanks. So I've been doing this for about 20 years, and one of the sectors I see consistently underrepresented is the private sector. And when we're talking about opportunities online, when we're talking about risks and content, everything we've talked about, the intersections of offline, online, you need the companies involved. So I think, and we've seen this across a number of CT spaces, whether you're dealing with border security or aviation security and else. So I will underline here, not just because it's my job to do so, but it's really something I've seen over the last 2 decades, that public-private partnerships are really key, and we need to be more proactively and creatively engaging the private sector. But that doesn't mean the private sector alone can do it. So at GIFT-CT, we're an industry-led nonprofit working with 30 member companies, big, small, and everything in between. And I think we're really unique in being that kind of industry-led entity that brings together such a diverse group of private sector actors specifically to look at terrorism and violent extremism content. But that work would be very difficult to do if we didn't work with a multi-stakeholder community that involves government, civil society, academia. And I like to say that when I came into this job, I thought that every company, like Some of the states we know have, had this red phone on their desks. It's all virtual and metaphorical, but you know what I mean. The red phone on the desk. And I thought that when there's a crisis, there's red phones ringing all the time. Everyone's in touch. Everyone calls each other. It's all good. There's a system. Turns out there isn't. And so it is really valuable. And I mean, I'm really biased, obviously, about GIFT-CT. But one of the most important things I feel we do is provide a platform where companies can talk to each other and share these insights, share this understanding, share good practices, and then sort of collectively engage with governments, with civil society, with academia, with communities. Otherwise, you end up with one-off, ad hoc experiences that don't always translate into building collective capacity, which is really what we need to do. So this is a plug for public-private partnerships. So when we talk about government, law enforcement, and all that, we need the private sector involved. But it's also a clarion call for silo breaking. And I think all of us see this in whatever sector we're working on. The silos between different sectors are just so high, and the complex challenges we've all talked about, whether Sahel, Afghanistan, Africa, like we've spanned development issues, law enforcement issues, human rights abuses, justice and accountability. None of this is possible if those silo walls don't come down and include the private sector, which has the resource and the capacity to address it. So I think that, like I said, I admit my bias. I think the development of GIFT-CT was a very positive iteration, but we need more of that kind of thinking, bringing these sectors together. And it's happening, but a little slow and needs to just be a little faster and a little bit more proactive.
Noreen, thank you so much. You wrapped up what I would have said about this panel more broadly is we've discussed the need for greater partnerships, relationships. That is how we are going to be able to continue improving humanity. So thank you so much, Hekmat, Wassim, Adejoke, Noreen, thank you, and thank you to the audience. We really appreciate you all attending. Thank you.